Media bias. Practical limitations to media neutrality include the inability of journalists to report all available stories and facts, and the requirement that selected facts be linked into a coherent narrative. This inability provokes media bias within the mass media in the selection of events and stories that are reported and how they're covered. The term media bias implies a pervasive or widespread bias contravening the standards of journalism, rather than the perspective of an individual journalist or article. The direction and degree of media bias in various countries is widely disputed. Market forces that result in a biased presentation include the ownership of the news source, concentration of media ownership, the selection of staff, the preferences of an intended audience, and pressure from advertisers. We can also mention that government influence, including overt and covert censorship, biases the media in some countries. The most commonly discussed forms of bias occur when the allegedly partisan media support or attack a particular political party, candidate, social group of people, or ideology. In their article, Media Bias in Presidential Elections, a meta-analysis, published in the Journal of Communication, researchers D'Alessio and Allen list three forms of media bias as the most widely studied. Coverage bias, also known as visibility bias, when actors or issues are more or less visible in the news. Gatekeeping bias, also known as selectivity or selection bias, when stories are selected or deselected, sometimes on ideological grounds. Statement bias, also known as tonality bias or presentation bias, when media coverage is slanted towards or against particular actors or issues. Other common forms of political and non-political media bias include advertising bias, when stories are selected or slanted to please advertisers. Concision bias, a tendency to report views that can be summarized succinctly, crowding out more unconventional views that take time to explain. Corporate bias, when stories are selected or slanted to please corporate owners of media. Mainstream bias, a tendency to report what everyone else is reporting and to avoid stories that will offend anyone. Sensationalism, bias in favor of the exceptional over the ordinary, giving the impression that rare events, such as airplane crashes, are more common than common events, such as automobile crashes. Balance, when an issue is presented as even-sided, despite disproportionate amounts of evidence. Other forms of bias include reporting that favors or attacks a particular ethnicity, religion, gender, age, sexual orientation, ethnic group, or even person.